to your point about anti-Asian racism because of coronavirus, I was actually not going to make any comment or remark on it because, whatever, right? Trying to keep my head down and be a good little Asian boy. But I think what kind of sparked this desire to come on and like talk to you, Mike, about, let's just say anti-Asian racism generally, right? Because now that's kind of entered into the lexicon in the mainstream, right? People actually understand what anti-Asian racism is. It's not just like this joke phrase, right? And I've been thinking about it because I was browsing through Reddit. So I've read like a whole bunch of think pieces in the New York Times and all these Asian American like wannabe writers, like they've written all this, they've spilled all this ink about how, like I can't believe someone told me to go back to my country or call me a chink, or like, all the violent assaults and harassment that have taken place, acid attacks, group beatings, things like that, right? And, really, to be honest, I wasn't going to pay much attention to it. And then I came across this thread, like all that, none of that stirred me to action, Mike. None of that. I was reading all this about that poor woman that even got the acid splashed on her. And I was just like, at this point in my life, like, I'm at that point where I've just become numb.
Wait, okay, so let's go back to this. I think this story is about somewhere in New York. I think an Asian woman was at home and she went outside to throw the trash or something, and somebody was waiting outside, and I think he threw acid on her, something like that.
Yeah, I know. And they wouldn't even make it racial at first, which is something that happens a lot to Asians in America. And so I was thinking about this, right? Like, like all this horrific shit is happening, but it's not happening, like I'm like, sequestered away in my own like apartment where I'm working from home. So I'm not really going out and encountering or seeing these things, although I've seen like signs of it, right? Someone spray painted "fuck chinks" outside my apartment building, and this is in Koreatown.
Wow.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah. But I wasn't gonna say anything until I read this. I saw this video by this Asian American or like Asian Canadian, I forget which he is, pickup artist, actually, if you can believe that. He goes by, I think, Squattin' Casanova. And so I clicked on this video, right? Like I usually am not a huge fan of pickup artists and all this kind of stuff, but I was curious what he had to say about this because so many Asian Americans are coming out now with their own like individual videos, podcasts, talking about it and all that kind of stuff, right? And I'm just curious what people are saying.
So you're saying all this stuff that you've seen, the acid attack on an Asian woman, somebody writing "fuck chinks" outside your apartment in Koreatown, none of that bothered you, but to the point where you have to say something, but something involving an Asian American or Asian Canadian pickup artist, someone who teaches, I guess, Asian men how to get women, that's something that I guess made you angry?
Yeah, I think it really made me angry because I think, to be honest with you, Mike, I feel like I've been pretty burnt out, like I spent a lot of years of my life, really, I hesitate to say obsessed, but you could call it that. Like, like really being passionate about Asian American advocacy. But, like the things that I've come to learn and the things that I've come to realize is that, it was kind of a learned helplessness to a certain degree. You're just like, oh, nothing was ever going to change. And because of the personnel that's involved and like history, and I can touch on that right after this piece. But you're right. The thing that really struck me, it wasn't even all these like older Asian elderly people getting harassed or bullied or beaten, or all the little Asian kids, or like all the Asians that are going to be socially murdered by this pandemic and the shutdown, which is going to close all their businesses, and they can't really make a living in the legitimate economy. That's why they're running those businesses, especially in places like K-Town, the 626 in LA, right, where all the Chinese Americans are. Like you're basically condemning those that can't go back to their countries to death, right? And none of that really penetrated this like hard shell of, I guess, cynicism that I've erected over the years. But this guy really got to me, and I'll tell you why he got to me. You know, like he started out this video, and I promise you I didn't watch any of it except for like the first minute. And the reason was, you know, he was talking about like, oh, listen, you know, I've heard a lot of people complaining about racism, and like, I don't agree with like this victim mentality that Asians have, blah, blah, blah. Oh, and I think the number one thing to remember, so this is how he starts off. I'm going to talk a little bit about, you know, anti-Asian racism and how to respond to it. But I think the number one thing to remember first and foremost is that most people are not racist.
Hmm.
And I'll tell you, Mike, I shut the video after that. I clicked X, I X'd out of that video, and that's when I texted you. And I said, you know, I was like, okay.
That was today.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. So you might be wondering why something so seemingly innocuous would set me off. And I think the reason why is that in this day and age, sorry, I'm trying to calm myself down because I'm actually really heated now. In this day and age, to say a statement as wildly ignorant, factually incorrect, and ahistorical as that really does a disservice to all those victims. And I'm not just talking about COVID-19, you know, like the people that are suffering anti-Asian racism now. People are like, anti-Asian racism, oh my gosh, it's finally here. We're now like Muslims after 9/11, right? Okay, yo, listen, we've been like that since the 1800s. And I wanna bring something up, you know, just because, you know me, I like to dabble in history, right? I like to have an understanding of where things actually came from. And I want to read you this quick passage, if you don't mind, okay? And this is from 1969, right? It was during the Vietnam War, and right after like the, you know, the African American Civil Rights Movement. And this was during the Asian American movement, right? Like during the Asian American movement, the way they portray it now during the 60s is that Asian Americans, you know, like marched alongside Black people, and like you had students protesting, you know, colleges for Asian American studies, and like that's basically it. Okay, that's all they really teach you. But the actual Asian American movement was a revolutionary movement, and they've completely cut that out. And what I think is interesting is just the way Asians in America back in 1969, all right, that's our parents' generation, okay, at least for you and me. I'm a millennial, you're a millennial, right? So this is during our parents' generation, or maybe our grandparents' generation, right? This is how Asians in America sounded, okay, 1969. All right. Asian people in America have been continually oppressed by the greedy, traitorous gangsters of our own communities, and by the wider, racist, exploitative American society. We've been bombarded by the media with false ideas about how we should accept our position in this society. They have tried to brainwash us and have even coerced us into going overseas and fighting against our own people in Asia. But Asian Americans have been fighting back against the oppression of this country ever since we first tasted the bitterness of America's racism and exploitation. The long and heroic history of the Asian American struggle inspired and strengthened us in our purpose. No longer can we endure these oppressive conditions. We cannot let our ancestors' struggles, all right, we're talking about Asian Americans here. We cannot let our ancestors' struggles go down in vain. We know who our real enemies are and our friends, and we have a new strength, for we are joining sisters and brothers within this country and around the world to fight for freedom and justice against the rulers of this country, okay? We have tried the peaceful means of petition, courts, voting, and even demonstrations, but our situation remained the same. We are not free. We want to improve the living conditions of our people and are preparing to defend our communities against oppression and for revolutionary armed war against the gangsters, businessmen, politicians, and police. When a government oppresses the people and no longer serves the needs of the people, we have the right to abolish it and create a new one. This is how Asians used to talk in America.
That was from 1969.
Yeah.
Who said that line, by the way?
This is actually, so this was a manifesto that was written by the I War Quen. They were named after the Boxer Rebellion in China. Okay. And they were a group of Columbia students in New York, Columbia University, right? So like, fairly well off, well-to-do. And they were really fighting for their communities, fighting for things like healthcare reform, like not having to be drafted into the Vietnam War, childcare, counseling. But I think what's really incredible here is the language, right? Or even some of the demands. Okay, so in 1969, there was actually two radical Marxist-Leninist organizations in America that were Asian American, okay, that were fighting for the rights of Asian American people. On the East Coast in New York, you had the I War Quen, right? These guys. And then on the left coast, the West Coast, right? You had the New Red Guard Party in San Francisco, led by Alex Hing, okay? So just so our listeners know, the I War Quen was surveilled by the FBI, right? They did to them the same thing they did to the Black Panthers: infiltrated, monitored, surveilled, tracked, blacklisted, all those things. And the same thing happened with the New Red Guard Party, except even more severe. The police actually cracked down on the New Red Guard Party. But I just want to, taking all that aside, I just want to talk a little bit about the language that's being used here, right? And the ideas that are being promoted, again, by Asians in America in 1969. Like, this is not some far away history. These guys were like here from 1969 to 1972, I believe, and then they actually merged with the New Red Guard Party.
Yeah, they sound very very revolutionary, very very communist.
Yeah. But and actually, so was the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was communist. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X were socialists. They were supported by the Chinese Communist Party and Mao Zedong, who was funding third world revolutions against Western imperialism throughout the Cold War, right? So that was not just, like within Asia, but also in like Cuba, Africa, I think.
But that language, again, the language that you're talking about, when they're saying things like the traitorous gangsters of our own community, and
yeah, exactly,
all this, like, it's very different than what you would expect from Asian Americans who are attending Columbia today.
Right, exactly, right? What happened? Like, listen to this. We want self-determination for all Asian Americans. The masses of Asian people in America live in ghettos, which are like small colonies, right? And this is true. Look at K-Town, look at 626. Those are ghettos. The American capitalists continually try to make profit off us by trying to alter our entire way of life for their own benefit. We want liberation from this enslavement so we can determine our own destinies, And Western imperialists have been invading and colonizing countries in Asia for the past 500 years. American imperialism, concentrating in Asia, is now engaged in the most sadistic and genocidal war of aggression the world has ever seen. We want an immediate end to American imperialism. I mean, if you look at the New Red Guard Party's platform, like, you want to talk progressive? These guys were talking free healthcare reform, right? These guys, Chinese Americans, took up guns to fight for this for Asian Americans, all right? They wanted free medical care for Asian Americans. They want freedom for all Asian Americans in jail. They wanted all Asian Americans sitting in prison to be released. They wanted to end police brutality against Asian Americans. They wanted affordable housing for Asian Americans. They wanted full employment for Asian Americans or guaranteed income. Think about those demands. These people were willing to fight and die with guns in their hands in this country, our own people, in order to win these rights for us. That was the actual Asian American movement. That was the movement that led to the birth of the label Asian America, And it's always really frustrating and funny. It's like really comical to me. How Asians don't understand this history when it's like really, you know, like easily accessible, it's open. You know, the only thing I can think of is that the idea is that we have so little power that even with all this knowledge, we can't really do anything about it. You know, like if I'm thinking pessimistically, you know. But I'm always shocked by the fact that Asians in America do not understand this, because if you really want to think about it, if you want to think about what's the major difference between Asians in America today versus the Asians in America that were, you know, there in 1969, like, yo, I mean, listen to this stuff. Like, this is great, right? People of color, Asian, Black, brown, red, are all fighting for liberation from America's racist oppression. Millions and millions of white people are also rising up to fight our common oppressor. We recognize that only when the oppression of all people is ended can we all really be free. You know, like, this is heady stuff, right? You know, like, this is stuff that, you know, when Asians are like, where was our Malcolm X? Where was our Martin Luther King? Well, motherfucker, you just don't want to find them. They were there, you know? These people were there. They were living, you know, they shaped the communities you're a part of. But, you know, like, let me put it like this, right? Asian Americans, you know, Asian America, period, is a product of white supremacy.
How so?
In two ways, right? One is in a straight up, we would not physically be here. Asians would not be in Western countries like the US, you know, like Canada, like UK, like Australia. Asians would not be in any of those Western countries if Western countries had not invaded Asia.
Right.
So literally the community, there would be no Asians here if the people here hadn't gone over to our countries and fucked them all up and bombed them all to shit and robbed and raped and reduced to ashes, you know? So that's number one, point one. The second point is that there has always been a really strong counter-revolutionary and reactionary element within Asian America, right? Ever since like even like the 1950s, like right after, like even during like the Korean War and throughout the Cold War, you had all these Asians in America, like Chinese Americans, for instance, just like the Japanese Americans during World War II, they would turn on each other. They would snitch on each other and call each other communist spies to the US government in the hopes that the US government would allow them to exist, which they didn't. You know, like the same people that were ratting them out also got deported and went to prison. It's actually kind of ironic and funny in a tragic sort of way. But after 1965, the community, after the new Hart-Celler Act and the Immigration Act, the entire process of immigration into this country is structured in a way that the only people that come in are counter-revolutionary or reactionary. Notice I did not say conservative. Even though many of them identify as quote unquote conservative or Republican. You know this. A lot of Korean Americans are like this. A lot of Chinese Americans are like this.
What is meant by reactionary?
So let me put it like this, right? And reactionary is it's a Marxist terminology, but let me put it like this, okay? There is no such thing as right wing, okay? Or there is not really such a difference between liberal and conservative. This is a false dichotomy. This is a distinction that does not actually exist. All right?
You're saying there's no difference between, say, the Donald Trump and the Joe Bidens of America?
Yes. I mean, you get this, right? Even white people are starting to wake up to this shit, right? But I think the important thing to realize is liberalism, right? Like this whole idea of liberalism. Most people don't know what that word actually means, and they don't understand like the nature of what Western liberal democracy actually is. Because if you look at our political system in the United States of America, there is no the only spectrum is liberalism, period.
Liberalism meaning free what, free market?
Okay, so that's how they couch it, right? Free markets, free trade. So just to give a quick primer, because I'm not gonna delve through like 500 years of history, although like you have to do your homework, right? So I'll give the cliff notes, right? So Western liberal democracy, the whole idea of it, right? Liberalism, it refers to economic liberalism. So you got it correctly. Let me take that a step back. So previously, right, like this idea of a political spectrum originating from Western society or Europe. Back in like 1600s, there was a 30 years war, okay, between a bunch of different European countries. And it was really bloody. At the end of it, that's that whole Game of Thrones type era, right? Where it was kings and queens and, you had the priests and the church, right? And each of those would be out for their own, like the kings and queens would be out for their own personal glory. The church says glory for God, but really glory for themselves, and it was highly unstable. Like the political environment was very unstable. So in 1638, they created the Treaty of Westphalia, which basically established countries like France, England, like all these other, Germany, right? It established these countries as sovereign nations, independent of kings and queens, independent of the personal lives of the rulers. Mm-hmm. Makes sense? So rather than obeying kings and queens and priests, right, you now answer to something called the state. Okay? And the state was an institution that would outlast any individual person. And on top of that, this treaty only applied to Western countries or European countries. So all these European countries, after all these bloody wars, said to themselves, you know what? We're not going to fuck with each other anymore. I mean, they still do, but like whatever, right? But we're not going to fuck with each other like we used to. Let's do away with all this, right? Let's create these sovereign states, like you can create constitutions and like systems of government, parliamentary democracy, whatever, right? And that form of government and that institution is going to outlast the people that are individually in charge today. And we're going to, as long as you guys are white, we're going to respect your form of government. Okay? Mm-hmm. And that was a real transition in human history, at least from the Western perspective, right? So you move from an era of like feudalism, right? Where you had like an actual you had a king and queen, a sovereign that was over the entire country, and they were the state, right? Like we are France, right? As a person, like the Sun King Louis. But at the end of the day, what they found out was, that's just going to lead to a whole bunch of like bloody wars and murder. So how about this? Instead, we're all going to get together and say, instead of having all power of society vested in the hands of a single person, right, or people, including the church, what we're going to do now is we're going to work with our institutions to try to find a way to govern and administer, right, our countries. And the way they did that, right, is by having the heads of state making pacts and deals with local businessmen to control the people that were within their spheres, right? Because the problem is always one of administration, like if you're looking at a centralized governing body, how do you like administer across vast regions, like physical distance, right? Well, if you're thinking about it and you're like, okay, well, I'm not going to last, like, let's say, like I have a certain term limit, or like, this country is going to outlast me in the event of my death, right? And so I don't have like absolute sovereign power. And by the way, that's where the term right wing comes from, right? The idea of a right wing or a conservative originated from France, and it's a political philosophy aimed around supporting the king or the monarch, But that ideology does not really exist anymore in the Western world, okay? After the Treaty of Westphalia, conservatism does not exist on the political spectrum. There's like echoes of it, right? Like allegiance to like the whole idea of a king and queen in England, treating them like celebrities, or like listening to like the Catholic Church or religion or whatever, right? But as a political ideology, it was no longer viable in the new form of government that came about in European countries after 1638. What you then had was different forms of what we now call liberalism, right? Liberalism meaning you no longer have direct state authority over many different domains of everyday life within a country. Instead, the state has outsourced that to the businessmen that run large chunks of the country, right? And they work together in order to keep the country and its citizenry under control. Michel Foucault does a great job of deconstructing this, you know. But the idea is that there hasn't been any political ideology outside of liberalism in the Western world since that time. And what is liberalism? What are like the results of liberalism, right? Like this idea that now it's no longer about glory for the king or glory for God, but now it's just about as business people gain more and more power and status in society. Previously, they're just the merchant class, you know, below, not even considered something that's a respectable profession. But now suddenly everything is about making money, right? Because now you have business people that are really deeply involved in administering and controlling the population of these countries, which was previously done through either the king or queen, the sovereign, or the church, right? To regulate their behaviors. So check this out. Liberalism then creates this false dichotomy, and they say, oh, you can either be liberal or illiberal, right? You can be liberal or you can be authoritarian, right? So authoritarian means in their world, oh, the government has the power to administer, has like the influence and the sphere of control. And then in a liberal society, right, economically liberal, government does not interfere with business, and instead it is business that runs and controls the population.
Okay.
So if you think about it from a democratic, let's fast forward to today. If you think about it from a democratic versus Republican perspective, it doesn't really matter because they're both liberal, right? They've co-opted this term liberal to mean like socially progressive, right? Oh, I virtue signal about women's rights or the rights of minorities. I cry crocodile tears over children in internment camps built by Obama, you know? So like, it's just a layer of lip gloss, but fundamentally the fundamental governing political ideology is the same, is the exact same. Now, if you're thinking about it from, let's say, a left-wing perspective, right? And when I say left-wing, I mean like communist. I mean like Marxist-Leninist. And let me just quickly to define communism. Marx never clearly defined the difference between socialism and communism. But I think one of the best ways he described it is that communism is revolutionary socialism, okay? And what he means by that is that rather than socialists, you know, like just bargaining with their bosses or, you know, like trying to take direct action and blah, blah, blah in these like limited spheres, revolutionary socialism seeks to seize not just the means of production, but the means of power in order to transfer the means of production into the hands of the workers. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? So in this sense, the liberals look at that and they're like, oh, that's so authoritarian. You know, they make authoritarian sound bad. They make it sound like you're being controlled, right? But really, the difference is control of one kind or another.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Because in a liberal society, you're not controlled by the government. You're rather controlled by business, and the government acts as like a proxy, you know, like they work together to administer the country. At the far, you know, like end spectrum, like the terminal point of liberalism is actually fascism, when corporations and the government are intertwined and become one singular entity. You know, like back in the days of kings and queens, except now it's business people that are our new emperors. Jeff Bezos is our new monarch. You feel me? So the problem is that Asian Americans get indoctrinated into this Western liberal ideology. And so their minds can only think or imagine liberal solutions to things. And what is a liberal ideology, right? Well, the liberal ideology is the ideology created by the wealthy business people that are running this country alongside, in collusion with the government, because that's always how it's been since 1638, right? The president has a whole economic council of like CEOs from the top Fortune 500 countries in America. This isn't even a secret. Okay, so this is, and the business plot and all this kind of stuff. Like this is like straight up history. These are facts. Okay, you are controlled by corporations. But the way they trick you is by saying, oh, because it's not the government itself controlling you, even though it's supposedly a representative democracy, you're free. You're free to starve and die and get harassed and be racially discriminated against and all this kind of shit, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think that's like the major issue I see, like politically for Asians, after having come here past 1965, all of them are liberals. I don't care if you're a Democrat or a Republican. I don't care if you like go up on the soapbox and say, oh, Me Too, time's up, all this bullshit. Oh, I care about POC, all this bullshit. Yellow Peril supports Black Power, hashtag. This is all bullshit. You guys are at the end of the day fascists just as much as the other fascists. You're all liberals heading towards fascism, right? Liberals just think if you keep throwing like, social safety nets or like, crumbs at the poor or the minorities or basically the oppressed and the marginalized, they won't revolt, and it will allow you guys to continue this gravy train for the rich people in charge and the politicians that are, like doing their bidding. You feel me?
So you're saying let's say some Asian American college students who go to rallies or marches against Trump or
like the women's march. Yeah, it's all garbage.
You're saying they would be the same as, say, Asian Americans who support Trump and
go to Trump rallies, yes. And I know that's a hard thing to stomach. That seems so like, how can you say these two are the same things? Well, I think the easiest way to say that they're the same thing is to look at the foreign policy of Democrats and Republicans.
The foreign policy of Democrats and Republicans, what is the difference between the two when it comes to foreign policy?
There is no difference.